Yeah, and I am very excited to be with you here with you guys tonight. Brooke said I am a pediatrician, but a little bit of background also about me. I did grow up in Maryland. One of the fun things about Maryland is we always talk about what county we're from. So I'm from PG County, so just a little bit south of y'all, and grew up there my whole life, and then went to college in Pennsylvania, married a Pittsburgher. And now I've been in Pittsburgh since that time. And I work at Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh, and our center works out of that hospital. My interest of why I ended up going into transitional care as a piece of what I do is I'm actually a med peds trained doctor, which means I did a dual residency. I did internal medicine and pediatrics. And so I have had the opportunity to kind of work in both of those worlds. And one of those things that I recognize about working in both those worlds is they're very, very different cultures, being in the adult world and in being in the pediatric world. And I knew there was a really important need for a bridge between those two worlds as you're aging and moving from pediatric to adult oriented care. So really the Healthy Transition Program was born out of that. And I can tell you the reason why this was really, really important to me was I joined our center, like was said, about 12 years ago. And I went to my first conference called DISMIG, so the Down Syndrome Medical Interest Group. So that is the conference for healthcare providers who take care of individuals with Down syndrome. And we were in Indianapolis, and Mary Ciccarelli, who's kind of a founder of transitional care, was giving a talk to our group. And so this is providers from every major center across the country. And she asked a very simple question of who amongst us had a policy statement around transition, meaning who had done the first step in helping think about and create space to think about what transition should look like within the Down syndrome community. And only one hand went up. And it really just surprised and shocked me that while we are healthcare providers who take care of individuals across the whole lifespan, we had not done a lot of work here. And so it became really, really apparent to me that this was an important area that needed to be worked on. And I've been on the journey with a lot of our families now for about the past 10 years since we started the Healthy Transitions program. And it is probably one of the most fulfilling aspects of my job, as each person's transition is unique. So as I talk about transition and I talk about the pieces for the toolkit, I want you to recognize that your individual transition has to be individualized to you. And so I'm going to give you guys some guideposts, but it really needs to be individualized to your family, to your young adult, and what that looks like for them. So on the page right now, we're about to talk about bridging transition. So I'm currently in Pittsburgh, been in Pittsburgh now for 20 years. And this is the Roberto Clemente Bridge. So this is the bridge that if you're coming from downtown Pittsburgh and you're walking on the left-hand side, you can see Pittsburgh Pirates Stadium. And so this is one of the three sister bridges that's in our downtown. Pittsburgh's known because it has more bridges than any other city in the United States. And I think bridges are really, really important when we think about transition because, as we'll talk about, often movement from pediatric to adult care can feel like crossing a huge chasm. And we're going to talk about a bridge as how do we build something that is solid and can help us make that jump or cross that chasm. So we're going to be talking about bridging transitions. So as we talk, I want to just to give you guys a quick highlight of where we're going to go. I'm going to first talk about why. Why is transition important? And it's not just being like, well, yeah, everybody gets older, so we need to do this. But what is the heart? What is the kind of the why, the thing that drives our passion to do transition well? We're then going to talk a little bit about transition pitfalls. Those are to say, where are the areas, where are the soft spots as we transition? Where do we need to be thoughtful about how we can prepare people well to know where those soft spots are? Then I'm going to talk about a philosophical process or framework for transition. What are the steps that help build that bridge well? And then we're going to operationalize it. I'm going to hopefully give you guys really great tools that you can help work with your healthcare team to think about how you make a transition well together. And I know I sent material ahead of time that gives you all of these tools. So I don't know if that got sent out to all the participants, but it'll be a resource that's available. So all the things that I've highlighted as we're going through this are things you guys can have access to. And I'll also highlight some really great websites that are repositories for all of this stuff as well. So that's kind of where we're going to be going. So first of all, I want to talk a little bit about our why. So when I think about the way in which the medical community looks at disability, I would say it's broken, right? So we come from a model of saying, where is a problem and how do we fix that problem? And so when we think about this idea of disability, we view it from a framework of disease, right? So we say, well, there's congenital heart disease, there's digestive problems, there's intellectual disability, there's behavioral disorders, right? We view the things that need to be fixed. And I want to start this dialogue of why I say that is a broken system, because when we think about disability and why transition is so important, is that really disability is connected to this idea of diversity, meaning that there is not anybody who is the norm, right? The norm is this illusion. All of us bring unique aspects of who we are that are really, really valuable. And so when we start labeling things as broken, that's where we get into trouble. Disability is really about a diversity. And I want to give you a real quick example that hits home. So I know that all of you are watching me virtually, and I know some people are on their iPhones and things like that, but I bet some of us who are watching on the computer or throughout your day, this is what a lot of us are doing. I know I have teens and preteens. So this is one of the great ways that communication happens, right? So text messaging. And we would say that text messaging is probably the more used format for the cell phone than oral communication. And so the question comes, well, where did text messaging come from? And the simple answer, it wasn't technology created for people could hear. It was actually created for those who have hearing impairments. So the purpose of it, right, was that it centered people who have hearing impairment. And I'm an individual who has hearing impairment. I wear hearing aids. For those who can't hear well enough to use a cell phone, it allowed you to use that as a communication device. But the reality is when we centered that technology in a way that allowed individuals with hearing impairment to use it, it actually became very, very beneficial to all of us, right? So we use this more, and that came out of this idea that we recognize that the uniqueness, the diversity of hearing impairment added value to all of us as a community. And so it's really kind of this bell hooks model, right? That when we start thinking about the idea that everybody brings value and we start looking at the margins, the people who are always centered and valued, and we say, well, what helps make things work the best for them? It's something that ends up bringing value to all of this. And you may be saying, well, Dr. McCormick, I completely agree with you. What does this have to do with transition? And it's really simple as this. We all talk about inclusion all the time, thinking about education and thinking about how can we make sure that our kids are not only present, but also valued, right? But that goes into the idea of transition. Transition is about knowing that a young person becoming an adult is more than age. Just because you're 18, 20, 21, 25, you may age into the category of adult, but there's something more than just being physically an adult. We want who they are to be valued. And so transition is the purposeful and planned process for optimizing how that individual is as a human so their full self can be brought to adulthood, so that who they are can really impact us as a society. And I know you would all believe as parents that your young adult, your kids, bring something unique and they are valuable. And the reality is we have to make sure that the pitfalls that often happen in transition don't change that ability for them to bring their full person forward. So our why is that we really want to think from an inclusive standpoint, that who they are is valued, and we want to optimize how they move into adulthood in a purposeful and full way. And so the question is, well, what are the pitfalls? What are the things that often get in the way of that process? And the first one is one that I'm sure all of you have thought about. Often parents will tell me they're scared about. And that's what I call the transfer leap. The idea that we as a healthcare community do not do a good job talking about transition. Someone's 16, someone's 17, 18, 19. No one's even told them where's the line in the sand. Like, is it 21? Is it 26? When do we have to go to the adult world? No one's having that conversation really well. And then one day someone says, oh, you're making your follow-up appointment. You're too old to come back here. And so you're afraid of that leap, right? They're just going to say, nope, you can't come here anymore. And you have to leap and go to the adult world. And you're like, well, I'm not ready. We're not ready. We haven't been prepared. Are we going to actually get there in an effective way? But even when we as a healthcare community start talking about transition, not only can there be a transition leap, meaning we just let people age into adulthood, often what we do is we try to build a bridge, but we do it incompletely. We don't do it with purpose. And so it feels like a rope bridge that if we're going to walk across it, we're not sure if that slab is going to break and go through. The reality is, right, is transition needs to be like this high suspension bridge that's made of steel and is strong and you can trust it. But it's really easy to see the steel that's crossing the chasm. But there's two things I want us to really think about. That transition doesn't start the moment you're moving to the other world. When you have a bridge, there is an on-ramp, meaning that there is a way in which you go from the solid place you are and you move onto that bridge. And then you cross the bridge and then there's an off-ramp. So transition isn't a moment in time. It's a longitudinal process that crosses from early teens all the way into adulthood. And we're going to be talking about these 6 core steps to say, well, this is how transition is done. It's through discovery, tracking, preparing, planning, transferring, and completing. I want you to hold on to thinking, what are those topics? Because we'll get there in a second. But the first idea is that transition needs to be longitudinal, and it doesn't happen at the moment that someone moves to the old world. That is transfer. That's the physical movement. Transition is how we do this in a longitudinal way. The second pitfall that we often see is what I call silos of care. And, there are lots of domains in our young adults' lives that work this way, right? Hey, the healthcare team, they're worried about healthcare, and they're just focusing on that aspect of their life. Hey, the school is worried about what's going to happen. When are they going to graduate? What are they going to do after that? Where are they going to work? Maybe there's a legal system that's talking about, well, what about power of attorney? What about guardianship? What about decision making? There's a financial piece that's saying, well, what happens when I become 18 and I'm applying for SSI? What are the things that go into that? What are the complications? What happens if someone gives me a large inheritance? What am I going to do about that? And then there's community, right? Often our young adults, they go through high school, they're 21. Their whole community is the school that they've been in. And they have 2 losses, right? All of a sudden at 18, there's a huge community that leaves as a lot of their peers are going off to college. And then there's this second loss when they turn 21 and they leave school, and that all that structure, that order, that community is gone for them. And the problem is each of these domains are only thinking about their silo. And the problem is I really see these as like pieces of a puzzle. This is more what reality is like, right? All of us, we did a lot of puzzles during COVID, right? And we know that the worst thing you can possibly have is when you have a puzzle that is missing a piece. You could do a 1,000-piece puzzle, and if one piece is missing, that ruins the whole puzzle, right? And that's because each of these puzzle pieces are reliant on each other. So when we think about legal or employment or healthcare or community or finance, we have to address all of these. That doesn't mean that me as a healthcare provider are required to do everything, but I need to be thoughtful about this. So what do I mean by this? What I mean is that let me give you an example. If you had a young adult who had type 1 diabetes, right? And as a healthcare provider, I did a really good job of making sure we were managing their diabetes. We were using insulin. We were getting them tightly controlled. But guess what? I didn't do a good job at giving them self-care skills. I didn't give them a landing spot with an adult provider. I just said, okay, you're no longer the one. I'm no longer the one who's in charge of taking care of you. You need to figure this out, right? So I gave you a bad transition in healthcare. The school did a great job. They got you ready for college. You're in college. You're doing great. But guess what? All of a sudden, your health is no longer being regulated well, right? You haven't recognized how to do your insulin care independently on your own. Your parents were helping you quite a bit. All of a sudden, your sugar numbers are going high. You're going to the hospital because your body is going into DKA. You're going into an acute crisis. And so you're missing school. And all the next thing you know, you have to go back home and you're out of college. It had nothing to do with the education system and never had anything to do with how you were transitioned there. It had to do with how your healthcare was transitioned. And each of these domains have a different story like that. They all impact each other. If you don't specifically thinking, right, within the Down syndrome community, thinking about those with intellectual differences, we know that those who have intellectual differences, right, 80% of those individuals graduate to the couch, meaning after high school, they graduate to not being employed and they're at home. What does that do for their health? Well, they've lost their community and they haven't replaced it with another community because often your work community can be your next step. You're now at home, so you're not as active, you don't have your normal structure, and your health declines. So each of these are really, really vital. So transition has to be thought about holistically, pieces of the puzzle. So we see our first 2 gaps is that transition is done as a mere point in time. It's not done longitudinally. Transition is done in silos. It's not done holistically. But the next one is what I call the transition tug of war. The other thing we have to think about, another pitfall, is recognizing that relationships change as young adults get older. And the transition tug of war is really this story about we have different stakeholders in this transition process. And everybody is vying and pulling for their control, right? The young adult, they want to be independent. They want to do things on their own. They want to be in charge. The parent, they want to make sure their kid is safe. They want to not let go of that control, right? The pediatrician, hey, I've been taking care of this young adult. I've been doing a really good job. I don't really feel comfortable moving them to the adult world. The adult provider, hey, you don't actually know how to take care of adults. There are adult problems. And there's this tug of war of who should be responsible for what. And the problem is we don't recognize the fact that there is a developmental progression that we all are going through, and we need to support our young adults through this process. I really think of this as what I call the transition dance. So I have 3 daughters, and the way in which I view this is I can remember when they were just little girls, right? They were 2 and 3 and 6 years old, and we would have dance parties, right? And we would put on the music and dance, and they thought I had the best dance moves in the world, right? They're all looking to me, they're excited. But I can tell you right now, if I do that same dance with my 16-year-old daughter and all of her friends, it is a different story, right? She actually now is independent. She's a better dancer than me. She wants to be able to do dancing on her own. She wants to be able to kind of hang out with her friends differently than they were before. It's the same way when we think about healthcare. In the beginning, right? You as a parent are the caretaker. You know everything about your kid. You're the one doing all of the care. And your teen at that point is just a tiny little kid and just receives the care. But we can't have that same relationship when they're 21 years old, because we need to do a process where we start giving independence in a graded way. So eventually, based on the developmental readiness of our young adult, we make them the CEOs, the supervisors of their care, and we are giving them that support role. We're the consultant. So we have to recognize that also one of the bridges and challenges around transition is this leveled developmental independence that we have to work through. We have to walk in as a dance, giving them more of a chance to take the lead. So as we think about these different pitfalls, right, that transition is done too late, that transition is done in silos, and that transition is more of a tug of war, we need to think, well, what's the solution? How do we make it longitudinal? How do we make it holistic? How do we have this dance where they're giving them graded independence based on their developmental readiness? And that's where I start thinking about these 6 core steps: discovery, tracking, preparing, planning, transferring, and completing. So discovering is the first phase. This happens actually the moment your child is born and the moment your child is in your hands. See, I always think of discovery as like, if we are going on a journey, the first thing we need to know is where we're going, right? So I am not going to drive to Washington, D.C. from Pittsburgh if I don't first say I'm going to Washington, D.C., because I have to know where my destination is so I can make my roadmap of how to get there. Discovery is saying we have to dream for our young adult and say, how do we get to that process? And we're going to talk about a little bit of what are the nuts and bolts of what that means in a few minutes. But discovery is knowing where our endpoint is. Tracking is making those different stops along the way. Tracking is saying, is if I'm going to Washington, D.C. from Pittsburgh, I'm going to stop here. I'm going to get gas here. I'm going to get food here. This is the way in which I am tracking my process. Preparing and planning is the idea that our young adults, right, they are all unique and independent. And we have to think about where is their readiness? Where are they ready to take on those skills of independence? How do we assess that? And then how do we push them forward? Transferring is one of the last stages. It's really that once we say that they're developmentally ready, that we've made sure they've taken all the steps, we know where we're going, that we can actually make that process of moving forward. And completing is the off-ramp. It's making sure that after we've done that process, we've been successful in it. And so what I want to do is really create a toolkit, right? We've talked a little bit about this philosophy of where we're going, longitudinal, holistic, that we're creating a dance, and that we're using these steps. Now I want to talk really nuts and bolts. How do we actually do this? How can we have a toolkit to be successful in transition? And so what we're going to do is we're going to talk through each of those 4 steps, and we're going to talk about how can we have a tool that helps work us through that direction. So the first one is discovery, right? Discovery is saying we need to know our destination before we start on that journey. And really, what discovery is about this educational foundation. How do we know what are all the challenges around transition if we don't start learning about it first? And I would say you really need to start with a holistic approach. On the screen right now, you can see a workbook called the Down Syndrome Transition Guide, but there's also a great resource, free resource online, Got Transitions. I'm sure a lot of us have seen this. It's, if you just Google it, it's a NIH supported resource that has all of the different pieces to the transition puzzle. All the different resources I'm going to talk about tonight, you can click on the parent tab and it'll have those resources available, as well as talking about these topics, right? If it's about healthcare, if it's about future planning, thinking about financial needs, planning for saving for the future, thinking about employment and housing, or legal decision making. The key thing when we think about discovery is saying we really need to create this foundation, right? This understanding of what goes into transition before we start building our house. So we know that if we just build a house and there was no foundation, whatever came by would just knock it down. So this is the hard work that we're doing today as we're talking about this, but also I encourage you after this talk to be able to kind of dig a little bit deeper. There also is this really great book. It is super comprehensive, so use it as a resource, but it's called the Transition Planning and Service Guide book. And it's a great resource to kind of, as you're going through this process, if you need a deeper dive. I would say the two most important ones would be using the website, and actually the Transition Planning and Service Guide is really great. The other workbook is really great, but it's out of print now, so it can be a little bit harder to find. Okay, so after you're kind of building your foundation of knowledge, your discovery phase, the next thing you need to do is operationalize it to your individual, and transition visits are the way to do that. Now, we may say, well, Dr. McCormick, we do not have a transition clinic. What am I supposed to do? How do I have a transition visit without that? Well, my plan here is to show you how you can use these tools with your doctor to kind of team up and create your own transition plan. And we're going to talk about these ideas of tracking, preparing, planning, and transferring. So the first thing you always want to do is, how do you build your team? If you're going to have a transition visit, you have to build your team. And I would say, how do you even think about doing that? So the first thing I gave you guys as a resource is I gave you something really boring, which is our transition policy statement. Now, I think a transition policy statement is a really important thing to bring up to your physician, first of all. Once you've chosen the person who's going to be that person for you, your primary care doctor, your doctor at your Down Syndrome Center, is ask them, do you guys have a transition policy statement? If they say no, you can ask them, well, do you have any recommendations on when transition occurs? And if they still say no, say, well, you know what? I want us to kind of, let's make one together, in the sense of transition policy statement for me is a contract between my patients and myself. And we're making an agreement. It simply says, hey, starting at 12 years old, we are going to start meeting on a regular basis, be it every year, every 6 months, every 2 years, whatever you need. And during that time, we're going to do a couple things. We're going to check in to say, what are the steps that I need to take to prepare for transition? We're going to work together to say, is my young adult ready for transition? Where's their readiness? And then as we go along this journey, we're going to decide together when that transfer date is. I often tell my families, hey, my goal is that by 21 years of age, your young adult is transitioning to the adult center. But you know what? It's unique to your adult. So as we go along this direction, we're going to refine it closer and closer. It may be 19 for some people. It may be 23 for others. But it's this process of starting to have this discussion. So the first thing you want to do is build your team, to have a discussion with them, invite them in, say, well, how can we agree upon what this process of transition looks like? It also, just so you guys know, what we do at our center is I have a 2-hour visit with each of my families for a transition appointment. That's not practical. We actually have funding that allows us to do that. But what can be practical is you can say, hey, why don't we have a visit every 6 months instead of every year? That 6-month visit, we're going to really just focus on this transition stuff. And you can tell your provider, there's actually billing codes for transition visits. And so they can bill for that time to make it happen. And so you can make sure to say, I just want to see you more often so we can do some of this work. And I can support you by offering some of these resources that we can work on together during those times. Now, the other thing I have down there that's really, really important, and I would encourage you as parents, Even if you feel like your teen is not ready, encourage your provider to talk to your teen alone. This is not a full discussion. For me, it's often the first time I'm talking with a teen alone, when they're 12 years old, I am just kind of letting them practice, talk to an adult that is not their parent alone. They're learning some of those skills of independence. And it can be talking about sports. It can be talking about interests. It doesn't even have to be about their healthcare situation. But as they start coming back to me for visits, they realize there's going to be a point where we talk alone and we need to start building those skills. And it kind of allows that dance, right? It allows them to have more independence. So as you're building your team, make your contracts, set up what the standards are going to be. But I would also encourage you in that is that your team needs to start practicing what it means to talk with a physician on their own with some independence. Okay. After you build your team, you're going to just say, okay, what are we going to actually do at these visits? What are the things that make up the transition? And the first one we're going to talk about is our transition checklist. So by a transition checklist, what I mean is this tracking phase. So if I have some knowledge and I know where we're going, and we're going to say, my young adult, my goal is that when they're 22, 23, 24, 25, be working in employment that gives them fulfillment, they're going to be able to have healthy relationships. They're going to have some level of self-care independence. That could mean doing their activities of daily living, doing their maintaining some of their own cooking, cleaning their house, doing the things that kind of help give them more independence, individualized to each of them, right? Where are they going to be and how do we then get there? Well, tracking is the way in which we start building those steps to get them there. I think of tracking as, getting on an airplane, right? When you get on an airplane, we've all been sitting on the runway and the pilot says, I'm so sorry, we're going to be delayed for 30 minutes. We found out something's wrong, right? It's usually like that the water in the kitchen isn't working. But the truth is what's happening is that pilot has to go through this huge checklist to make sure that plane is functional before you go up in the air. Transition is the same way, and the checklist is the tracking list. This is the way to make sure that we have taken all the steps that we need to physically do to help our young adult get there safely. And I'll show you, this is what we call our transition checklist. We also call it our registry. This is a way of us physically tracking that we are doing the things we need to do for successful transition. So you can see on the first thing on that list is our transition policy statement. Have we had a discussion? Have we created a contract together saying, when is transition going to happen? How are we going to collaborate to do that? Next on that list is that we're doing transition readiness assessments. We're going to be talking about that in just 1 minute, but really that is going to be about at every single visit, we are going to use a tool that helps us say, well, how ready is my young adult to move and to more levels of independence? I'm going to do this survey that helps me understand what skills they have. And then underneath that, it's not just taking this survey, it's this idea, then we create some goals together, that we're going to develop goals that help move them towards independence, and we're going to keep accountable in that process. So not only are we talking about the policy, not only are we doing readiness assessments, then we're going to also do what we call our medical summary. This is a really, really important output of the transition visit. It's the idea that we are going to collaborate to create a single document that summarizes the care of your young adult over the life of their childhood so that when they move to the adult world, there's a way of having that consolidated information for that new provider. We're going to go into that in a little bit more detail, but that's going to be part of one of the things on our checklist. And then you can see we start talking about some of these nuts and bolts things, right? So under adult care model, we see that has anybody had a discussion about this idea of being able to make decisions on your own? Your pediatrician should be talking to you is, well, how comfortable is your young adult with making medical decisions on their own? What about financial decisions? How are you going to develop a shared decision-making model? You should be having a discussion about this idea of, hey, is power of attorney the right thing for us? Is guardianship? And your care provider should be having that discussion with you. And then some really, really, really important things under there is what says the timing of transfer is what I call our quit date, meaning we need to start having a discussion about when will we move to the adult world. And like I say, it usually starts at 21 with my patients. And then at every visit, we refine it, right? If we're starting at 21, maybe when they're 16, I'm saying, hey, does 21 make sense for you guys? Okay, if we're thinking about 21 that makes sense, let's start thinking, should that be in the summer or should it be in the fall? And then by 18, we're saying, okay, we are definitely going to say our goal is that by July 25, we've moved to the adult world. okay, to do that, we need to make sure that we have done this, this, and this. And those this, and this is the next thing. Who are all the adult providers that I need to move to? You may have a new primary care doctor, but you may also have an endocrinologist or a cardiologist or a pulmonologist. And you need to be having a discussion with your kind of transition team to say, well, who are those landing places I need to be having? In what order should we do that? Should I be making my appointments with my adult endocrinologist and pulmonologist and maybe hang on with you until I've made all those jumps? What is that process that we should do it? And that's part of this checklist. And then finally is the transfer of care list. And that's like my last checklist that I go through to make sure we have everything finalized. And we'll come back to that at the end. Okay, so we've developed our transition team. We're setting up our transition visit, and we say one of the things we're always going to go over is our checklist to say, are we doing the things we need to do? And the question is, well, what are those things? And one of those is what we call our readiness assessment. So the readiness assessment is really this preparing and planning phase, right? So we said the tracking phase is there are things we have to do, and everybody needs to do them. The question is, how do we do it individualized to our young adult? Because we know that some young adults at 18 are way more mature than some adults who are at 21. And so we need to say, what is unique about my young adult and how ready are they able to make that jump for independence, right? And how do we decide what that is? And that's the preparing and planning phase. And how we do that is something called readiness assessments. So the tool that I use is called the TRACS, or the Transition Readiness Assessment Questionnaire. The reason why I do that is for two reasons. This is a validated tool to assess readiness for independence in healthcare needs, and it's been validated within those with intellectual differences. So it's a great tool that fits very well with our community. The other thing that's really nice about it is I said one of the kind of hooks you want to have with your transition team is saying that you can bill for it. If you use a validated tool like TRACS, then that helps with the idea that you will get reimbursed for your time. I also think TRACS is just a really great tool. And the way in which I use it is not that I just have, the young adult and their parents fill out this form and say, we're done. I ask them to go through each of these things and basically get an assessment of where they at, right? So we can see those different topics are medication management, appointment keeping, tracking my health issues, talking with providers, doing some of my daily activity management. And what we see is we go on like a spectrum, right? We say, hey, I'm not doing that and I'm not sure how, all the way up to, yes, I do this and I do it every time on my own. And so we're going to be able to see what are the strengths that my young adult has and what are the areas that we need to work on, right? And so this is just an example of how this could be filled out, right? That there are some areas of strength, right? We can see that we do a lot of our own self-care things. So meal planning, keeping my room clean, being able to navigate some of my neighborhood stuff. I'm actually doing really well with that. But then I can see some of my other things like managing my medication or making my appointments. Those are areas where I need to do some work. So what I will do is I track this over time. So I see you at 12, I see you at 14, I see you at 16, and I can see how things are improving. But at a single visit, what I will do is say, where are the areas of most need? And what I will often say is everybody in this room is really, really important in this young adult's transition to adulthood. So I want us to look at this and each say, what is one goal that we are going to work on in the next 6 months? So an example of that would be if we looked at this kind of specific track, we could say that maybe 3 of the things that we would come up with would be that we are going to learn how to take our medications independently. We're going to make a list of questions to talk with our doctor, and we're going to learn how to keep a calendar. And that's great, right? We've made this list. But the thing we have to do after that is then we really need to not just say we're going to take our medications independently, but we really need to drill down and say, how do we actually do that in small incremental steps? So an example of that is that I would say is like, hey, we are not going to go in 6 months from not taking our medication at all to taking it independently. Often I'll say, well, what are we doing now? And if a parent is saying, well, what we're doing right now is, my young adult is taking Synthroid, they're on thyroid medication. And how we're taking it is in the morning, I go to the medicine cabinet, I take their medicine out of their bottle, I put it in their hand and they take it, right? What is the step that we can do to start working towards independence? An example of that would say, well, the first thing I want you to do is just buy a pill tray. And every week, I want you and your young adult to sit down together and fill in that pill tray. And then every morning, you're going to tell your young adult to open up the pill tray and watch them take it, right? The beauty of something like that is like a step that, number one, you're sitting shoulder to shoulder and teaching them a skill. So as you guys are filling the pill tray, you can ask them, hey, do you know what this medication's for? Give them some health literacy. You can say, hey, what would you do if you took 2 of these on accident? Or what would you do if you felt like I was having a reaction, right? You can start having a discussion with them. And then you've also given them a tool that once they've mastered it, maybe in the next 2 years, you recognize, hey, they fill their pill tray on their own. They take all their medication every week on their own. But another thing they're recognizing is they're going to have a week advance notice when they run out. So you say, what happens when you fill your pill tray and you realize your bottle's empty? What's the next step you want to learn? Oh, well, maybe I'm going to start learning about what do I do about refills, right? So it's a way that you can build on the process. Or maybe you say, oh, your young adult now has a cold that turns into a sinus infection. And so your doctor prescribes penicillin or amoxicillin for them, right? They get this new medication that's thrown in the mix. The good news is they have a system that all they have to do is say, okay, on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday this week, I'm going to put an amoxicillin pill in the morning and the night, and I'm just going to take them with all my other medications. So it's a way of building on those skills. So we really need to say, not only we're going to assess where they're at, we need to create really, really practical, buildable goals that they can be tracked and then more towards skills of independence. One of the resources I gave you guys in a PDF form, and you can go to your favorite, you have the right to print this off for if you want. This was created by Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh and CMU, and we have all rights. So I give you guys the right that you can print this. This is a workbook that your young adult can use with you, and it talks about some really important areas of transition. It talks about sexuality. It talks about financial stuff. It talks about just how do we start thinking about what it means to be an adult. But another section it really has is about this idea of like, what are healthcare skills? So the tracks, that tool I talked to you about, we basically took each of those different subheadings and we created workbook areas that you can then work on that aspect of it. So for instance, if one of our things we talked about is like, the skills I want to do is make a list of questions I can ask my doctor. So what you have is you have this workbook where you can sit with your young adult and say, hey, we're going to work on this skill. Let's think about how are we going to talk to our doctor? And you then can role play with them and say, okay, let's make that list. Let's practice how you would ask that question to your doctor so that when you're there, you get the chance to say, hey, remember that question you had? Why don't you go ahead and ask your doctor? And it's really wonderful. I love when my families have done that work ahead of time because I always ask first thing, I'll turn to my young adult and say, hey, I'm your doctor. My goal is to help you take care of your body. What questions do you have for me today? And I love it when they're like, well, I'm having knee pain. I'm like, great, tell me a little bit about it. And then we start a discussion. But they need that work, that practice at home so that can get them ready when they're coming into that appointment. Or you can talk about skills for learning how to make your own appointment. Or like I said, questions about when I take my medication together, fill in that pill tray. What are questions you could ask your young adult to work on their health literacy around medication management? So use that tool that I gave you guys. You can print it off, use it as a workbook with your young adult to kind of work on some of those skills. Okay. So we're tracking, we're making sure we're doing this stuff. We're doing readiness assessments to kind of say, where is our developmental readiness and how are we going to push them towards independence? The next thing I talk about is transfer gear. So these are the physical things that we need to have in hand when we move to the adult world, right? These are going to be the things that equip us to be successful in the adult world, right? So this is the transferring phase. So once we've built that bridge and we're walking across the bridge, the movement to the adult world is transferring. And this is probably, from a healthcare perspective, one of the most important tools that you can have in your hand when you walk to your adult provider. It's called a portable medical summary. Another term for this is sometimes it's called an emergency medical plan. The idea behind it is you are creating a document with your primary care doctor that helps summarize healthcare in a single page, right? I know that your kids have been in the children's system for 15, 16 years of their life, right? So if you printed all their documents and you gave it to an adult provider, it would be thousands of pages. I can tell you right now, the first appointment you see with that adult provider, if they have a 1,000-page document, they are not going to be able to read any of it. So they need someone who can help summarize and direct some of that for them. And this is a great document to summarize and direct the most important things that are for them. And so I'm just going to walk you through. So the top part of it really talks about some of those nuts and bolts things. So like everything from insurance, but really underneath that, legal and healthcare power of attorney or guardianship. It says, how does our young adult make decisions? And who is the person who's supporting them in making those decisions? Underneath that is also what I highlight as kind of some ways in which an adult provider can learn a little bit about your young adult before they even meet them. And this is this idea of saying activities of daily living, pain, communication, and preference. And what I mean by that is the first time an adult provider is meeting your young adult, you want them to understand what is an everyday kind of meeting with that young adult like, right? And so like activities of daily living, what kind of skills of independence do they have? Are they able to dress, bathe, toilet, feed, do their hygiene on their own? You can even say if they're awesome with all of those things, there's something called individualized activities of daily living, some of the kind of the washing the clothes, keeping my house clean, making my own food. But you want to kind of give that adult provider a sense of what kind of level of independence does your young adult have. Then the next one is pain, right? Our young adults, they all feel pain, but as you know, the way in which they portray that pain may be very, very different. And you are the expert with your young adult on understanding that, right? You may say, well, I know my young adults in pain when they kind of get more quiet, or when they do, they may not say anything, but I might know that they're in pain because they have restriction in a movement. You have this unique aspect of knowing what pain looks like for your young adult. And I want you to be able to share that with that adult provider because they're going to be meeting them for the first time. And that's a really important way that they are going to be able to know how to care for them. And then communication is the next one, right? We all know that one of the biggest challenges can be that our young adults often have a lot better receptive communication. They understand what's going on than their level of expressive communication. And sometimes when they're in a new environment and they're really excited, they may talk quicker and they may actually have more challenges with some of their expressive language, right? So you want to share, hey, things that help me communicate is if I'm talking fast, just ask me to talk slower and repeat. And then kind of sharing with that provider what level of communication your young adult has. That can let them know, where they're at and the way in which they can best communicate. And then the last thing I always say is preferences. What is the best conversation starter? Maybe your young adult loves one specific singer or loves one specific sports team or has one specific interest in something. And it allows that adult provider to have a quick way of connecting with them. So I think this is actually one of the most important parts from this, from a humanistic perspective, right? How can an adult provider understand humanistically what your young adult is like so they can make some of those connections? But then there's also the medical side, right? As we're moving down, it's really, really important that we do a good job of summarizing what are the health challenges your young adult has. So you would make a list of these things. So like if they have a diagnosis of insulin-dependent diabetes, you want to say, like, when did they have that diagnosis made? What is their current management like? What is their current control like? When were their last studies done, right? And you need to work with your pediatric provider to say, how can we summarize this problem list, these challenges, in the best way possible so that an adult provider doesn't have to go through reams of paper. They have a starting place of knowing this key information. But then also underneath that is we want a specific list of what medications they take. Maybe they have special equipment. Maybe they're on CPAP or BiPAP at night. They want to know not only that they are, but like what machine do they use? What kind of mask do they use? What are their settings? So that they don't have to figure that out. They can kind of have a sense of where that is and they can start that process going. Also, it's really important to have family history and immunization history. But the last thing I would say is also having that check back, right? The last thing is a list of pediatric providers that have helped navigate this road. So an adult provider knows who to call if there's a question that arises. And who should be on that list? It should be who the pediatrician or family practice doctor, all the subspecialists, but also things that we sometimes forget. What pharmacy do you guys use? If you have any DME companies, right? Who are they so that they can know how to provide? And also any great community supports that you're already connected with. So having this whole list is really, really important. Also, the other transfer gear, we're not going to get into it, is having these really, really other important documents. So your power of attorney or your guardianship, thinking about a resume, right? I always say it's really important to start writing a resume with your young adult as soon as you can, because all those volunteer experiences, all those school experiences that are in the workplace. You want to build it in a way so that when they move into the workplace, you can remember those core things that they have. Also, making sure they have appropriate legal documentation. So state IDs, birth certificates, all those things are really, really important as you move into the adult world. Okay. And then the last thing, as we're kind of wrapping up here, is thinking about this idea of a graduation packet. So that's the completing phase. We've done all this work. We've moved to the adult world, but what's the check back? How do we make sure that we're successful? So I always think this completing phase really should be talked about as a graduation packet. Just like it's a celebration when you graduate high school, it's a celebration when you're moving to the adult world, because it means you've achieved something. When you've done it well, when you have a well-built bridge, that means that you're developmentally ready to be there, right? That you've done all the things to be successful there, and it should be something that's celebrated, not something that we're going to be feared. And so we think about things like ask them to do a warm handoff. That means your your pediatric provider calls your adult provider, sends a letter that sends that portable medical summary with it so that there's a communication point. You finish your transition checklist, right? You make sure that all those last things are done, including updating your portable medical summary. The other thing that I put in this list is our adult preventative care guidelines, right? It is great. Adult providers are really good at taking care of and helping individuals who have a lot of medical complexity. They do it every single day. So the thing that's unique is that there's a certain lens that we need to look through when we think about what are some of the challenges that people with Down syndrome run up against. And we can equip people by giving them the appropriate review articles that support that. And we have the Down Syndrome Medical Interest Group has worked in collaboration to create adult guidelines that now exist. And that was one of the documents I gave you. And also just make sure there's clear connection points. And that's like in the end of the portable medical summary. If you have a problem, they have a way of talking back and knowing who to communicate best with. So in summary, just remember that we're talking about a holistic process. So transition visits shouldn't happen when you're 18. They should be starting when you're 12, and they should be happening multiple times over time. I will also be transparent. I often will see 18-year-olds, but then what I do then is I see them at 18, 18 and a half, 19, 19 and a half, 20, and I see them frequently so we can make sure that we're doing that work to get ready, right? But transition also should be holistic. I know I've focused a lot on healthcare, but we actually have transition checklists that kind of are more holistic. We make sure, well, what's happening at school? What's your IEP done? How are they getting you into the workplace, either through volunteering or early job experiences? Hey, are you working with OVR? Is that a good fit for you? Is something better? What about financial decisions? Have you set up an ABLE account? Have you started thinking about trust funds? What are you getting ready for Social Security income? What does that look like for you? What about legal decision making? Have you thought about power of attorney versus guardianship? And so we have some checklists that help us think holistically. And then the final thing is recognize this is a dance towards independence. And we need to support our young adult in that way. And so with that in mind, I like to, I'm in Pittsburgh. So this guy right here, Fred Rogers, is pretty famous in Pittsburgh. He actually went to seminary just down the street from where I live right now. And he has this quote that I think so beautifully connects with the idea around transition. He says, transitions are almost always signs of growth, right? But they can bring feelings of loss. To get somewhere new, we may have to leave somewhere else behind. And I love when I'm talking to parents about this, because this hits us most, right? We have taken care of that person when they were a little baby all the way to now, and they still feel like that little baby to us, right? And we have to recognize within ourselves, there is a loss for us, right? But the beauty, there's something new, is hopefully we're helping that young adult have a level of independence that really lets them shine, right? That they can be adults, not just present, but valued. So we can create an inclusive experience for our young adult. And that's what transition is all about. So thank you guys for letting me talk with you a little bit tonight. And I actually don't know how long we're going tonight, but I am happy to ask questions, and I can stick around for a while.
Hi, it's Brooke here, and I'm just going to try to bring us all back as I have spotlighted you. Let's see. If you want to stop sharing, Andy, and yes, then we can all kind of see each other. And if people want to raise hands or put question in the chat, that would be great now. Because I can't imagine nobody has questions. I know I do.
And I see in the chat, there's a couple questions about the resources I sent ahead of time. I'm sure that there will be ways that we can kind of share that with people who are interested.
Actually, there are a couple people I already sent them to
Perfect.
them. I mean, to me, when I hear you speak, I think, oh my gosh, the folks up in Pittsburgh are so lucky to have a doctor who's so committed to transition. I think about, I guess it's like for me, like I haven't heard of a doctor who has the same sensitivity and I guess way of looking at this as you. And so I feel like, gosh, I'm going to have to really educate my daughter's pediatrician to do what you're doing. And unless I'm thinking, gosh, we're going to have to come up to Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are thinking that right now.
Yeah. And I would say like, it's like anything, when I talked about creating transition goals and like, it's a big goal to be like, we're going to take our medication independently. So we have to create it in bite size. Pediatricians are the same way. We have to give bite sizes, right? And so like, I think one of the solutions around this is saying like, we need to have small, frequent appointments and be like, hey, today I want us just to talk about this idea of a transition readiness assessment questionnaire. We're going to have a regular visit. You can even fill out the questionnaire beforehand and you can help lead the discussion and say, hey, this is what I want us to kind of work on. Or, hey, this portable medical summary is really, really important to me. Can we work on this together? I can fill out a lot of this stuff. And then you ask them, hey, can you help me fill out the medical piece of this? And I think I agree. I think one of the challenges, and I'll just admit, unfortunately, our healthcare system hasn't done this well. I think it's unfortunately an area that needs a lot of growth. And it's an area that we need a lot of advocacy, right? And as parents, you guys are some of the greatest advocates out there to really push that. And so doing that in bite-sized chunks is one of the ways that we can do that well. As far as in the DC area, I do not know. So our transition clinic is one of the unique transition clinics within the Down syndrome community, but you don't have to come to a transition clinic only within the Down syndrome community. You can look around and say, what are other transition-based services? So, and I know that there are some in the area because I know that Got Transitions and that whole group is out of the Bethesda area. And so there are resources that are available within it. And I actually looked up and there's multiple conferences. I know George Washington University has a very, very strong transition program, and they do a lot of work within this sphere. And they put on kind of national transition conferences. And so it is a little bit of exploring, but I don't think you have to have somebody who specializes in transition. You have to have the tools to then support a provider who's willing to go on that journey with you.
Does anyone else have any questions about, here's one. You mentioned DSMIG earlier. Is this a widely known group, and could that serve as a helpful credential in finding such a provider?
Yeah, so DSMIG is, I don't know how many people are aware of NDSC. I mean, there's a bunch of national organizations. So NDSC is the National Down Syndrome Congress. So the main thing that they do in this sphere. So I feel like there's a lot of national Down syndrome organizations that do a little bit of different things. So NDSS does a lot of super advocacy skills, but NDSC, one of the things they do is they put on a big national conference. And DSMIG, the Down Syndrome Medical Interest Group, are Down syndrome providers from across the country who have our conference at the same time as NDSC. And so we kind of go around the country. So we have a website. So if you just look DSMIG USA, we have a list of providers who are members of DSMIG. And that would be the cohort of not only providers that are physicians, but it talks about behavioral health specialists. It talks about therapists. So OT, PT, speech. It talks about our researchers. So the people who do major research within the Down syndrome community. So it really is a touch point to think about of those who are healthcare professionals who are interested in working within our community. It's a great resource for that. I'm actually the vice president of DSMIG.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions? You can either come. Oh, I see. Anne, are you coming off mute?
Yes. Thank you so much for providing this image. Sorry.
It's okay, Anne.
The image of a bridge is so helpful. My daughter's about to turn 18 and she's nonverbal. She has autism as well. I just wondered if you had any advice for those who have multiple disabilities.
Yeah, I think, 18, so this is my own, 18 is challenging, and I think it shouldn't be, but the US government has made it challenging because one of the things we say is that at 18, you are an adult, right? And we all know that, it doesn't matter who you are, that the the adult brain is still well developing into your 20s, even up to age 29. So there's a lot of development that happens. And so we know that 18 is just an arbitrary number. But the important thing when we're coming up to 18 is we really need to make decisions about financial and legal decision making. And as a family, so the two ways I think about it, and I'm getting a little bit of tangent, but like these are really, really important topics that people just don't talk about. I don't know how many times I've had discussions with families when they're 17 and no one has brought up the concept of power of attorney or guardianship with them. But the default, right, is when your child turns 18, that they are their own decision maker. So what that means is that access to information is restricted to that young adult being the only one with access to it, and that they can make all those decisions independently. We know functionally that isn't often how it happens, but the truth is the safety nets, right? The reality of what can happen is that you can lose access to financial information, healthcare information, legal information. So we need to create systems around how do we support decision. And I always talk about using the least restrictive method to support decisions. And really there's two different mechanisms. One is power of attorney. Power of attorney is where a young adult has the capacity to make decisions and they give a trusted adult, often a parent, sometimes if the parent isn't present, a sibling, but they have the right to say, I'm going to include you in the circle of information. That's what power of attorney does. The young adult is still the decision maker, but they allow people to be in the circle of information. And so that parent, that sibling can know what the financial information, healthcare information, and they can support them in that decision. But recognize that in a power of attorney situation, that young adult is still the primary decision maker. That works most effectively when we have young adults who know their kind of limits, right? They can say, hey, I trust mom and dad to help me make these decisions, and I know where I can do okay. The next level up, right, is where we start thinking of guardianship. That's where a young adult can't make their own decisions, and a court has to decide that that young adult needs someone to be appointed as a decision maker. Now, that can be variable. So in Pennsylvania, we have something called kind of limited guardianship. So, hey, I can't make financial and healthcare decisions, so someone needs to be my guardian. All the other stuff I can do. So a judge can decide this person, mom, dad, are going to be the guardians in relation to healthcare finance. But all the other things, signing my paychecks from work, doing all these different things, I can still have that ability and I can have power of attorney with those. It's really, really important to know within your own state, what's the flexibility between those things. And I always say, my general approach is use the least restrictive mechanism, but also it's a family decision. That means what I do as a family and what Brooke does as a family can be different. We can have the kids who have the same ability, but there is a level to which we have to be comfortable with it as a family, right? I know lots of parents where I can tell them that their kids probably would do great with power of attorney, that they can kind of work closely together, they work beautifully together. That's the least restrictive, but for them is extraordinarily paralyzing to not do anything besides guardianship. And so I have to kind of work within the domain of what makes sense for them. Now, I would say power of attorney is super easy to obtain, right? I usually would say going with a lawyer and pay the $100 to have the lawyer be the person who writes it up and then is your notary in that process is great, but you can do it online and make it super cheap and you just need a notary to sign it. Guardianship is a much more expensive and longer process. Neither of these processes can really be started until you turn 18 because that's just what the government says. Like the parent is the guardian until the moment they turn 18. At 18, guardianship can be a process that's moved towards. Usually you want to start that process. I always say about 6 months before, if that's the direction you're going to go, because you have to collect things like a deposition from your physician. You have to get a court date. You have to work with a lawyer, and they have to build a case to be able to say that the young adult needs a guardian. And so that process can be expensive. We have a couple different resources. So we work with Pitt Law, and we kind of connect our families to do some pro bono stuff or work with some lawyers who give a discounted fee for our families, but it can be up to $5,000 for that process. And I think that's a real tragedy. This is a great area of we need to think about advocacy in this because the reality is, right, why is the default that we say that at 18 is that someone has complete independence in their own decision making? And then a family has to pay thousands of dollars if that's the appropriate support that their young adult needs. And that's a really challenging thing that I think we need to rethink as a country. But it's also, challenging because one of our kind of things that we support greatly is the level of independence we have. And I think it goes against that, and that makes it challenging. I'm talking too much about that stuff now, but I think that's a really, really important one. The second one is financial stuff, right? At 18, most of our young adults before 18, right, don't get a lot of financial support because it's based on their diagnosis of having Down syndrome and then their parents' financial profile, which for a lot of our families, that means they don't get SSI. But at 18, right, it changes. It's based on their diagnosis, and then it's also based on their financial profile. And most of our adults at 18 are still in school. They're not making any significant money. And you might be like, well, I don't really need that. We can financially support our young adult. And the truth is, SSI is a very small amount of money, right? It's like $700 a month, but it's also connected to some other really important resources. So usually your health insurance, your Medicaid, becomes really connected to SSI. And that becomes really important when someone gets past 26, right? Because kids can be on their parents' insurance typically till 26. And then what do we do after that? And so that can be important, but it's also really connected to something called waivers. And waivers are really, really important as people are moving out of the school system and they're moving into the workplace, because it pays for resources to help keep young adults in the community. So it means you can have a habit. So someone who works with your young adult in the afternoon and helps teach them how to navigate the community. It can be with job coaches. It can kind of help say, hey, my young adult can work at this location. We're working at a grocery store. We're working in an office, but they need some support, right? They can't go from 0 to 100. They may need some shoulder to shoulder support being successful in that workplace for a while. So I can tell you, we have a self-advocate in our clinic, right? She's worked with us now for 4 years. For the first 2 years, she had a job coach with her every day to kind of make sure she can understand how to do those tasks well. And we wanted her to be independent. So we wanted her to, and now she doesn't have that job coach anymore because she's gotten to the level of that independence, but it really helped her be able to maintain that job and become successful in it. So I'll stop talking. Those are probably the most important two big things coming up at 18 is thinking about financial things as well as kind of legal decision-making stuff.
That's really helpful to think about that. Thank you. Did that answer your question, Anne?
Yes, that's very helpful. Thank you.
When you were talking about the online forms, like for example, my typically developing children, I've always downloaded or used mamabear.com, which I imagine is it's different from what we need for our loved ones turning 18 who have Down syndrome or some other disability. So I guess with with what you're talking about, the power of attorney with finance and medical, is that a specific form online then for those that are different from Mama Bear, or I don't even know for those of you who don't know what Mama Bear is, like what I've used for my two older children. Well, they're not old. One's 18 and one's 21, but it basically says if they're incapacitated and we want to know what's going on in the hospital and we bring this paperwork that's been notarized, we can communicate with the doctors on their behalf, or we can communicate with the bank on their behalf if needed. So is that what you're talking about doing?
Yeah. So there's a little bit of difference. So there's something called a living will, and then there's something called power of attorney. So living wills are those documents that say if when, right? If I become incapacitated. So before that point, right? Before when I have full capacity, there's no access. It's only once you get to that point, do you get that access. And so that's what a living will is. Power of attorney, and actually all of us have probably given somebody power of attorney. When you sign up for a bank, you give them power of attorney because you are putting your money in the bank and you give them the right to help manage your money. So you sign all these documents, you're signing power of attorney so that they can financially have access to your financial information, your financial resources. So what power of attorney is there's something called durable power of attorney where it kind of covers all of the financial, legal, and healthcare. And what it says is even if I'm not incapacitated, right? If I'm perfectly healthy, I have access to the information. So I have the same access to the healthcare system. I have the same access to the financial information. That young adult still has decision-making ability, meaning they could still be like, hey, you could be in the room with me and hear all about the surgery I need, but I can decide I want to not have that surgery and I can make that decision, but you can have access to that information. And so it allows you to kind of, I say, be in the circle of information, meaning you are in the knowledge so that you can have a discussion and help your young adult navigate to what are the best decisions for them.
Okay. And I think that is what we're calling supported decision making. Is that the term that we're using?
Yeah. So
Okay.
supported decision making is often what we do. And I, I'll just be honest, I for some families, guardianship can be the best supported decision making model. The reality is, is that before 18, you are the guardian of your young adult. That doesn't mean that you don't get their input, right? And I know for sure families who've decided that guardianship is the best choice for them. And I'll just name the fact that it's often my families that their child has Down syndrome and autism, because that combination can make it really, really challenging for a young adult to make consistent decisions that are within what their desired kind of needs are, right? For those young adults, guardianship doesn't mean that they don't have any right in it. It just means that the parents have the ultimate right, and then they work together. So you can still have that shared decision making. So like sometimes we draw this really firm line and saying like, this is shared decision making, this is not. I just like to say it's a personal decision. I would just say you want to use the least restrictive mechanism, because there are some restrictions, right? Because they do lose some rights. They can't sign documents on their own any longer because they don't have the capacity to. That's what guardianship says. And that's okay for some people, and that's okay in some situations, but there's pluses and minuses on both sides.
Thank you so much. And unless there's any more questions at this time, I think that we have taken up lots of your time, Dr. McCormick, and it's been wonderful hearing your presentation and answering all these questions. And thank you so much for presenting to our group this evening. It was great information.
Yeah, and thank you all for letting me be here. I'm so thankful that there's I love the Down syndrome community, because everywhere we go, it feels like you're part of family. So thank you all for having me here today.
Thank you so much. And I'm sure we'll have you back, or maybe you'll even get some of us up in your clinic one of these days. We'll have a bus that brings us all up.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank y'all.
Thank you.
You got anything out of the?
I'm so thankful that there's I love the Down syndrome community, because everywhere we go, it feels like you're part of family. So thank you all for having me here today.
Thank you so much. And I'm sure we'll have you back, or maybe you'll even get some of us up in your clinic one of these days. We'll have a bus that brings us all up.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank y'all.
Thank you.